Okay, good evening, everyone. I am pleased to introduce the 2022 Marjorie Mead Hooker Visiting Professor, Hilary Sample. This prestigious visiting professorship was established at the UNM School of Architecture and Planning to honor the memory of architect Marjorie Mead Hooker. Pioneer in the profession of architecture, Marjorie Mead Hooker was the first woman to earn a Bachelor of Architecture degree from the University of Texas, the third woman to earn licensure and practice architecture in Texas, the first woman to be elected as president of AIA Albuquerque, and the first woman to serve on the New Mexico Board of Examiners of Architects. From 1951 to 1988, she practiced in several offices, including her own practice in 1990. She received the Governor's Award for Outstanding New Mexican Women in 2003, and she received the New Mexico Architects Medal from AIA New Mexico. Hilary Sample is the IDC Professor of Housing Design and Sequence Director of the Core Architecture Studios at Columbia's Graduate School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation, and co-founder of the New York-based architecture and design studio Moss. Since its establishment in 2003, Moss has won major national and international awards and been recognized in significant publications. Monographs about the studio include an issue of El Croquis and selected works by the Princeton Architectural Press 2016. Moss undertakes projects diverse in scale and type, spanning throughout North America, Europe, and Asia. Recent projects include the Petite École in France, a public pavilion for teaching design to children, 2019, Laboratorio de Vivienda in Mexico, a housing-focused education center in 2018, and Krabbelsham School in Denmark, a complex of 4 art studios in 2012, and a photographer studio in 2020. Also a collective affordable housing residence in Washington, D.C. is scheduled for completion in 2022. Moss has created an inventive and unique representational agenda that has influenced the discipline and demonstrated the importance of architectural representation in grounding of practice. Their work is held in the permanent collections of the Museum of Modern Art in New York, the Art Institute of Chicago, Harvard University's Francis Loeb Library, and Columbia University's Butler Library. Sample, along with Michael Meredith, is a recipient of the Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Museum's National Design Award in Architecture 2015 and the United States Artist Award in 2020. Please join me in welcoming our 2022 Marjorie Mead Hooker Visiting Professor, Hilary Sample.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Chris, for the introduction and for the invitation. I'm really pleased, and it's such an honor to be the Marjorie Mead Hooker visiting professor this semester, and I'm looking forward to the other talks that I'll give a little later in the semester. I would still love to visit, so maybe we can make that happen. All right, so tonight I'll share the screen. Here we go. Okay. So I'm talking to you tonight. It's a little bit strange maybe to see this image because it's an image that's also behind me, where I'm sitting in our office in New York. We're a small office based here in the city. Michael and I founded the office around, well, we're not exactly sure exactly when the date is, but really sort of started in Toronto when we were both living and teaching there, and then have moved back and had the practice a little while in New Haven when we were also teaching. I was teaching there, and then we've been in New York now for about 10 years, a little bit longer. And so here we're working on, as Chris mentioned, a variety of projects. We have really built the practice around a few particular types of buildings, from schools to housing and houses and artist studios. But we also do work and are interested in how architecture can engage a variety of different mediums and different forms of representation, and have built a practice around things like books. Most of the books in the image are some of the books that we have been making and producing kind of mock-ups and dummies and test things. Almost every project now we produce some kind of book in relation to that work. And then we're also working on a variety of other small scale things, like in this case, you're looking at some of the furniture, some chairs and ladders. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about the different projects and different scales, and maybe also spend different amounts of time on the different projects. I think one of the things we have had a lot of really great fortune, I think, in our working on a variety of different projects and in different locations. A lot of the projects that we have are not in the United States, and that's kind of interesting for us, an experience to practice architecture in this way. One of the first projects that we worked on in our first school project actually came through a colleague of mine when I was teaching, and recommended us for this project. We're often asked, how do we get our projects? I think it's a question every architect asks themselves, and I think in many ways struggles with from time to time, especially in the beginning. So I feel really fortunate that we had this opportunity to work on this project called Home, which is about a 2-hour airplane ride north of Copenhagen. And we met with the director at the time, Kurt Feinstein. He had talked with him for maybe 6 months, just kind of conversations on the phone, through email, trying to understand what he was looking for and learn a little bit about him, and certainly learn about the institution. He came to New York and we met and we talked and started to make some drawings. And then after that, it became a kind of time of working with him through drawing, really, and more drawings and exchanges that eventually really became the project. And in not too long of a time period, we realized that we were already, pretty much working towards construction drawings, and the project had really become real. And it's a very different way of working, and something that was very different than we had experienced before. Part of this had to do with understanding the process of working in a place like Denmark, and then in a place like Skive, and in a place like Home. And this was something that we learned because the client was someone who had built before and had a lot of experience, but someone who was also cared deeply about the place that he was the director of, and a place that was so concerned with art and architecture. So in this first image, you can see the context of Home. This is one of the existing buildings on the arts campus, and it's a very old building dating to the 1500s. And you can see the photograph, obviously, with the people, mostly women, in the kind of scale in the time period of their dress, really starts to date this particular image. These are some other of the buildings that come very close to that old building. They're also equally, I think, in my opinion, beautiful and very special in their location. Home, I'll stick on this for a minute. Home is what's considered to be a kind of folk school in the folk system in Denmark, and this one in particular concentrates on arts. And as I understand it, something like 60% of all Danish architects have gone through Home. And it's a kind of stop on the way between high school and university, really more on the side and the age of high school students who will come here to explore whether they want to actually pursue a career and an education in the arts, so related to architecture, art, fashion design, graphic design, and photography, or at least at the time when we were working on the project, the main kind of disciplines that were looked at for the school. So as I mentioned, the director had already been working and built projects on the campus. This is a house by Jorge Pardo. And then he also had worked with Atelier Bow Wow on their 4 Boxes gallery. And so when he asked us about could we work on this project with him, and one of the things that was most interesting and concerning was the way that the campus had been divided. Effectively, the way that the artist studios and the housing were sort of all intermingled. There wasn't really a kind of clear demarcation of where studios were, where housing was. And so as a student, it seemed as though you really didn't know where your friends were working or what they might be working on. And so part of the idea was to think a little bit more carefully about the way that the different disciplines could come together in a campus. This is a fluorescent artwork by Jeppe Heim, who is one of the most well-known artists from Denmark and a graduate from Krabbesholm, who at the end of this project donated this piece of art for the schools. So in looking at the campus, and this is the kind of first image that I showed you of the kind of major historic building. This is the 4 galleries, Box's studio. This was actually also a small pavilion built with students from SciArc that had done an experimental project with Krabbesholm, and then the Jorge Pardo house. So when we arrived on the kind of campus and had a chance to walk around, really observing that a lot of the buildings, while beautiful, were also really hard to access, and that kind of coming together really revolved around the main building in the center. At the time, there was thinking that these buildings more here, which is kind of on the southern side of our drawing, could be reused to become studio spaces. Part of the challenge around these particular buildings were that they were incredibly small and didn't really reconcile with the idea that Krabbesholm had and the director had about a kind of forward thinking around art and the production of art in art spaces, and that it wouldn't potentially not be big enough for some of the work that they wanted to do. Whether that's the actual physical scale of the artwork or just thinking more about how people work collaboratively together in a particular space. And so we had tried several schemes where we looked at different massing, made a kind of series of these massing models, these little sort of parts. And again, in this case, everything we made at the time, we had to think about how we could send to Denmark. So while we were making in our office, we also thought about ways to, in this case, be able to ship there that they could also then sort of play with. And so we, had done a kind of series of drawings that coordinated all of the parts and different kind of scenarios. And basically the sort of square footage that they were asking for necessitated somehow that these existing buildings would have to be added onto and expanded. In general, we try to take an approach where our architecture is produced through a kind of set of parts, through a set of maybe, and maybe Michael will not totally agree with everything I'm saying, but in general, sort of thinking about a kind of minimal sense of things and, what is the sort of bare minimum we need to be able to do something and not to do more than is absolutely necessary. And I think this kind of attitude and direction is something that we have taken on more seriously the more that we've sort of built projects. So in any case, so we proposed this kind of model and then really started looking and thinking about, in fact, what they might need is something slightly different than using those existing buildings. And could we think about that a little bit? And so that led to thinking about continuing this idea of these bar buildings, and then arranging them in a slightly different configuration around that particular space. We make some books, I'll come back to that. This is the existing site here where we were working. And then in the end, this is the construction of the building. So we had proposed that we would assemble these bar buildings in proximity to the existing studios so that as they could use these, they would be very close to a new kind of space and not only a new interior space, but also thinking about how we could produce new exterior spaces for the campus that didn't really exist at that time. And part of the thinking had to do with the idea that the forms, and particularly in the case of the structure of the roof, could extend beyond the base of the building and create a kind of covered space that would also be a new sort of space for the campus. So I just flipped through some of the drawings in this case. So part of the extension of the roof became a space for storage. Most of the mechanical equipment sits sort of tucked up in that space, but it would allow then a kind of very large, tall space. Other than the Four Boxes Gallery, there really isn't a space like this on the campus, and certainly not a space for production. So this was something new for them and rare. We use, in this case of the studio and the bar buildings, we have done a lot of projects where we're working with ideas of, really relatively straightforward geometries, including things like the size of the windows is just being kind of repetition of squares. The panels are cementitious panels with a very minimal spacing with a stainless steel channel behind to give some depth of facade and kind of bounce light around. The spaces then created underneath the extension of the roof are really spaces for students to hang out and talk and have conversations. We had suggested that they place some chairs outside, just a really straightforward kind of suggestion, and it really transformed the space. And the students really didn't have any kind of space like this that would be outside, but also covered. And in the climate that we were working in, this seemed like a really important moment because you were either always inside or always outside, but never had this kind of in-between space and a place just to sort of hang out at the same time. We do have conditions of snow in this case. And part of the project also had to deal with issues around the kind of thermal properties, and with the Danish energy code is something we also had to work towards. So this is the kind of coming together of the courtyard space. These are students, mostly architecture students in this particular part working. But it allowed for not only these different kinds of exterior spaces, but also for the ability to be able to see between the studios, and for an idea around just, really very simply to be able to see what your friends might be working on, and to be able to share ideas and have a more interdisciplinary kind of pedagogy and curriculum that could come out of the architecture for this. And here you can see back through to the other buildings, which, while I think they're, as I said already, they're really lovely, they don't really allow you to see in. You can't see what anyone might be working on. And so for our project, that was really important. I think another thing for us as well, we've had kind of really, I think, fortunate luck in working on projects that have really amazing sites. And there's always a temptation to reveal the site fully all the time. And the idea that you would design architecture, you would design a form that would allow for a kind of panorama experience. I think this is something that we've been really interested in trying to reimagine what that might be like, that if you didn't offer that, what do you see? And to try to, I think, have experiences that are varied and different. And so in this case, this is the smallest of the artist studios, and was made really for photography. And in this case, the view, this is the only view from this particular studio. And it's back out towards some of the existing buildings, but it's at a much smaller scale. It's much more intimate. And it's also much more up close. And this is something we've tried to play with across a variety of projects, no matter what type it is, so that you're always having a different kind of experience, and maybe understand yourself and others in relation to the natural setting, and that you're still constantly always learning about it, is something we're really interested in through architecture. I think also part of, so this is relatively recently, in the last maybe 2 years, I think this installation was completed. So also thinking a little bit about how in making architecture, and in the space of this project, which obviously it's a kind of big campus, and you could say that there's a lot of space available, I think there is still something about the way that we try to think about making buildings and placing them that allows for others in the future and future spaces to be fulfilled with other things, whether it's art, in this case, a kind of landscape sculpture, which then has these performances, which I think are quite wonderful. And then our project becomes just background. And this is something that's also really interesting to us. And the way that as we're working and thinking about the forms that we're making, that they're not taking up too much space, and they're not making a space that can't be added to. And so this is also something we're really trying to work on. I guess in that way, maybe I'll kind of move through in some of the projects. Some of them I'm going to talk about a little more quickly. So going from a school to really a bench, these are things that we worked on kind of at the same time in the office. We always have a variety of things going on at different scales. And even if they're all sort of relatively small scale, which is a scale I'm really interested in, we're still always exploring things. And in this case, we were invited by ADO, which was, it's no longer open, but in Greenpoint here in the city, as a kind of space that was a platform for artists and designers to really think about making design. They offered residencies, they offered space for exhibition, they had a kitchen and restaurant, and offered a kind of public, literally a kind of public platform for conversations around design. They also had a shop and fabrication spaces. It was quite, I think, a kind of wonderful place for the city. And so as part of their opening, they invited us to design something for them to help them launch the kind of opening of the building. So we took pretty seriously what they were asking about, this idea of a platform, and designed a kind of simple bench that could be reconfigured in many different ways to respond to the variety of functions that they wanted to have as part of this. So this is a kind of drawing, trying to demonstrate how they could potentially reuse this bench and make it in a variety of spaces. And yeah, here, kind of band playing. These are some models, very small kind of paper models. And then this is an image of it in the space. And different kinds of, organization and configuration. As part of this, it was a collaborative project in terms of, we invited Mary Ping from Sloan City Wins the Race, a fashion designer, to help us with the jacket. So it's also a kind of aluminum fabric with pleats and had many pockets to contain all the tools to be able to assemble and reassemble the benches in these different configurations. It had a kind of mirror finish. This is a kind of close-up image of it. We do a lot of work with metal. And so this was something we were interested in. As part of this, they asked us if we could put together an installation or a set of instructions for them, because they would want to be changing the installation quite often. They were having lectures, multiple lectures a week. And could we do that? And so at the time I was doing a lot of traveling, and I noticed in the airport bookshops that there were many basically coloring books for adults. And I really felt at that time there was a kind of incredible stress happening, and to the point that now adults also needed coloring books to kind of reduce their stress and their anxiety. And so this sort of played into the making of this book. So it wasn't just about how to assemble these benches in different configurations, but could you also then start to treat it as a different kind of book. And we eventually called it an activity book, which they sold in their bookshop, which was very fun to make. At the same time, we had been working on an installation for the Istanbul Biennial. We were invited to participate in that, and we made what was called a selfie curtain, and then the beginnings of this book as part of that, which is called an unfinished encyclopedia of scale figures about architecture, where we basically looked at, sort of started in a way with the kind of canon of architects and architecture, and really remove the architecture from the drawings. And what was left were scale figures. And we assembled this as a book that's really for designers, and for architects, for artists. It's obviously students, but to really think about the way that as architects we're drawing buildings all the time, but often figures and people and other kinds of things show up in drawings. And what does this mean? And what are we saying about the things that we're drawing? And some of the things are pretty straightforward, and other things really start to call very careful attention to what we have been doing as a practice and as a discipline, and who are we representing in our drawings. And so this is both a kind of beginning of a research project, which is why the title really is very specific in saying unfinished. We really invite others to continue thinking about this and continue the project in a variety of ways, but really to call attention to things like how we represent individuals and kind of inequity in our field and our discipline of how we are representing people and children, for that matter, which rarely show up in drawings and thinking about design. So that's something. Anyway, I could talk the whole evening about that, but we'll save that for later conversation maybe. And so at the same time, I have been working a lot on housing, not only in our office, but also in teaching. And this is something I care deeply about, and had a kind of wonderful opportunity to be invited. Along with Michael, we went to Mexico City and we kind of juried a competition that included around 80 international architects making proposals for small housing communities. And then we're asked if at the end of this jury, which we spent about a week looking through these proposals that included full construction documents and models, if we would consider selecting them, not just for them as their kind of design as they were, but could they be made into something different? And could that become what is I'm showing on the screen now is really this kind of campus master plan for effectively 32 houses that would be built as kind of prototypes and be part of what has become this project for a kind of study, a kind of institution on the study of housing design. And so we were asked to then not only design a master plan, but to also design the education center, which is a really kind of long building with a variety of spaces that include classrooms and gallery and a lot of kind of outdoor spaces. This is the project. We selected 32 offices. 32 was the number that was given to us because that's the number of states in Mexico. And then to think about the way that we could assemble these different prototypes to be a kind of a sort of collection, and think about the way that each of these prototypes come together to organize a sort of smaller space, like a neighborhood, and more kind of intimate campus. It's again a kind of incredible site. And then we face a sort of downtown. There was also a very beautiful cathedral with an incredible garden that was made of kind of series of topiaries. And one of the things that we understood about our site, which is very dense in the surrounding housing, but yet this, as you can see, sort of a little bit of the fields around the site we were on was empty, and that people from the neighborhood would kind of cross through on their way to the center of the town. So for us, we really wanted to make sure that we kept the building and the space open. This is not a fenced off area. And so we started to think about ways that we could try to make a connection through a kind of campus. As part of this is one of the books that we make these very large scale books. We spend an enormous amount of time drawing. And so in this, you can see the kind of education building as sort of one side of what we sort of feels like a kind of garden. And this is a kind of gateway through and all of the different kinds of housing projects. Again, while they're built as these singular individual houses, they were not designed that way. They were designed to be built in series. And so through the kind of client, which is in front of it, which is a mortgage lender for social workers. Effectively, this would be a place that not only students could come and learn, but contractors and developers. Part of the kind of situation is that often housing that is built really in series, and in kinds of construction. We all sort of know what that is, and it's not very good. And it's also built in a way that is not thinking about anything beyond just those individual houses built right next to one another. So this is really about trying to introduce not only a conversation around different kinds of building, different kinds of materials, but different ways to think about how buildings and houses could collectively come together to form neighborhoods. Often this housing as well does not have any other kinds of public spaces. It doesn't have things like grocery stores. So this was a kind of idea, was that this part would be the beginning of other developments around here to really showcase different ways to build. And that's something we had understood. This is sort of purpose of the project. And there are different kinds. This is Kalach's multi-story building, so that if you could kind of imagine these in multiples on a site, each architect really thought in ways of how they could bring together their different houses. So some of the images I'll just go quickly through. Our project was built with a very simple block and kind of ceramic block that was fabricated locally. The only thing we were able to really change on it, or that we were interested in changing, was the kind of color for it. And so we worked with them to do that. The whole project was built in less than 6 months. It's incredibly fast construction time. And these were some of we also thought of ways that could be very simple to maintain, something like an address, which would just be painted on rocks. And then I'll kind of move quickly now through this. And thinking also too about houses. We've spent a fair amount of time working on houses. Sometimes the houses look like houses or take on a kind of house form, but they're actually studios, or they're thought of more for workspaces. We also began thinking about the work that we had done on houses, and started to think a little bit about how we could represent them and make this more accessible. How can architecture be more accessible within our discipline, within practice, but also to a kind of wider public? And so we began a project where we started writing about houses, very specific houses, and writing basically a children's book. And we published this with the Canadian Center for Architecture and Querini Press from Italy. And part of this book was about not only understanding a particular history around housing, also a housing that is not really complete either, but then to talk about one of our projects in particular and the way that it's built. And so from there, then I'll talk about the house, which is what we call House 10. This is a house that's built through a few different parts that are all assembled together, kind of repetition of one bar. And when it converges, when they all sort of meet in the middle, we extract the middle to form a kind of garden space. Each of the bars is very small. It's only about, on the interior, it's about 14 feet wide, and these are each about 36 feet long. Each bar has its own program. So there's a kind of kitchen and 3 bedrooms, and then a kind of studio workspace on the other one within the kind of central garden. These are some of we make very large paper models. We also make kind of large wood framing models. We really study how the structure works and bring these to the site, so it's much easier to build a project. This is the final project assembled. This is for an extended family that meets quite often in the kind of forest. It's really a kind of large scale very dense wooded lot that is unusable. Basically, you couldn't farm it. There's so many rocks in the ground. It's quite interesting. And it's also one story. There's no basement. There's no second story. And it's really about also a kind of idea around aging in place. And for one of the family members had kind of mobility issues. So to be able to be in nature and to be in this kind of wooded and rock site and not actually have access to that, but still wanting to be in nature, this site and this house allowed for someone to be able to walk around the courtyard. This was something that was really important. As part of this project also, again, we spend a lot of time working in metal. We've done several projects with the kind of this sort of rolled standing seam metal that just really comes to the site on these kind of big coils and are unrolled and attached to the facade. It's not that easy, but it's not very difficult at the same time either. And so we have been sort of experimenting with this. We also really like the idea of the kinds of lines. I mean, it really does sort of translate from drawing to building quite easily for us in thinking about that. The interior also has a lot of furniture that has color, that's metal. These are all things that we design and fabricate ourselves. And it's a way for us that we can work with color that doesn't have to be so permanent in the architecture. Michael and we always like to talk about maybe where don't want to commit to a certain color. We change our mind about what we like. That's maybe a little easier to be done in furniture. You can always sort of take it away and bring something else there. The furniture also allows for a kind of extension of parts, and that's something that we think a lot about through the architecture and the physical forms of the buildings, but the furniture can do that as well. And show. And similarly, so this was a project then that's much closer to you all this evening than to me, but a project that we worked on in New Mexico and Las Vegas that was built for a museum of Outdoor Arts, which is based in Denver. And that museum was supporting Charles Ross, who has built Star Axis, and they were interested in having a visitor center for his installation, but a visitor center that you could stay in. So there was an idea in this case that a variety of people could come together and spend the night and see the site and leave the next day. So they were also really interested in how we could make a kind of project that would talk a little bit about a kind of growth. This is a very small house. The total square footage is around 1,200 square feet, something like this. House 10 is about 2,500 square feet. So again, we're talking about kind of small scale houses. In this case, we wanted to sort of experiment and play with the idea of forms that are maybe recognizable in their approach to parts. So things like porches or pitched roofs or solar chimneys in this case, and the kind of aggregation of these together. This house is also completely off the grid. And so part of the solar chimneys allow us then a kind of passive cooling as part of this. So sort of coming together. Another project that we worked on and was finished relatively recently was for a photographer, James K. Sabire, who had previously worked with David Adjaye and designed an artist studio for himself and his former wife, Lorna Simpson, in Brooklyn. As he began to think about ways that he could continue his own work, what kind of space could he do outside of the city? What kind of space could he make outside of the city? And so with the projects like Element House, some of the other metal houses we have made, we have been working with other artists. Could we begin to talk with him about designing a studio space and a space potentially that would also work as a kind of gallery for a more local community? So this was a studio that we designed for him that would allow him to make his photographs. And very interestingly, and one of the things we were very excited about in working with him is that he has a kind of similar way of working to architects, where he builds a lot of models. Often, though, those models will have water placed on them or set into water, or other things that we as architects would never do to our work. And then he photographs them. And so it was quite interesting process in working and with someone who directly works with models. This is not typical. I think as architects, you rarely have someone who's also working and communicating through making models. So it was just a kind of wonderful process. This is the final space. And part of it also in the beginning was he really sort of said he didn't want to have any windows. And for us, we have already been making architecture so much with windows and kind of large square windows. And so we tried to talk with him about this idea of how, for sure, in a site like this, you would want to have views and access to it, and then be able to close it off when you need to really have a kind of photographing a variety of models. And so, but also to think about this space as a place for a community to come together around different kinds of artwork and gallery. The kind of large scale windows would be really important for that. This building is also metal. It's a corrugated metal, and with plywood on the interior. We've been using a lot of this kind of combination of materials. Here again, this image, kind of repeating a little bit from before, but just that experience of having a very up close view of nature and not really revealing all of the site at once. This project, we could have easily asked him to remove a lot of trees, and we would have a kind of incredible view of the mountains in the distance. But we really said, let's keep everything as much as we can. In this case in particular, there's a pretty amazing view through here. But this was really important to us, and I think also to the experience of making art and making work in this case. This space is also a space of work, but a different kind of work. And that's something we're also really interested in, these different kinds of work. Although it's a gallery, it's not, or it's a studio, doesn't mean it's just one kind of work. At the same time, we've also been working on housing, and so the project in Mexico, but this is one of a couple of projects that we have been designing in Washington, DC, a kind of series of small scale row houses. We won 2 competitions for affordable housing and completely 100% affordable. And so that's something we have been designing. At the same time as that, we've been thinking a lot about working in the city. Our office is in the city. We live above our office. You can see right through our office if you come here, and you can look through the downstairs to the kind of garden in the back. And we're really interested in how neighborhoods and different neighborhoods function and survive, and the kinds of quality of spaces. And part of that, for sure, in New York is that there's an awful lot of vacant spaces that could easily be rented and used and provide better spaces for business and work, and then also living. For sure, we have a crisis in this country, not just in New York, but on housing and affordable housing. And so, this book is by Akhtar. We did with Akhtar. That just came out not that long ago, but a kind of study of vacant spaces just in Manhattan. And then we made proposals for how you might reimagine using some of these spaces. At the same time, we've been doing a lot of collaborative work. I'll just show a couple more things and then I'll wrap up. Collaborative work, a couple of projects with Tatiana Bilbao. This is a project that we were doing also in Mexico with Mayo and Dogma and HHF and Derek Delacamp's office and with Tatiana's office, where we sort of each were kind of given a part of a block, but we all met together here. This is in our office in New York. We were also meeting in Mexico and designing projects collectively and having conversations, which led to another project with Tatiana and Macias Paredes and Productora, where we were designing a more middle income house and kind of complex of houses with Emily Pulitzer in St. Louis. And this project is under construction now. And there will be 4 of our houses built. Everyone has basically 4 houses being built in a kind of public setting as a new kind of project. So this is sort of an image, still under construction, but there's landscape and there's a kind of public garden as part of that. This project is probably a little bit bigger scale for us, and thinking about issues around affordable housing. This was one of the projects that was initiated through the mayor's office. She had launched around 10 projects for Washington, D.C. This project is built in Deanwood. It's a historical and very important African-American neighborhood. I had one of the first African-American girls' schools in the neighborhood. And so this project is for 65 units. 13 of those are supportive housing, and it's 100% affordable housing. It's one of the most, let's say, supportive housing units offered in the city. And so there's a lot more need than what's been built in the city. And we really sort of maxed out the building envelope in order to get as many units as possible here, and provide this kind of 2 courtyards, which the housing sort of revolves around. It's a combination of mostly single loaded corridors, which is really rare when you think about the kind of affordable housing, and particularly when you get to a certain scale and density. Also here, unlike New York, we're able to have units that have 4 bedrooms, 3-4 bedrooms, and the whole, the kind of combination of units, the unit mixes vary widely. And that's something very different than what's possible in New York. So for that, I'm really appreciative for having an opportunity to work in a place like Washington. This last project I'll show, and this is a small scale school that Chris had mentioned in the beginning. We were invited to participate in a biennial, the first, excuse me, the first biennial for NSAV and the School of Architecture in Versailles. And they were interested in a project that would take on designing for children, how to teach design to children. And we were really excited about this, to work with someone that would be willing to accommodate this in their university. I think is just pretty phenomenal. And so we have also done many biennials, and we really at this point understand what it means to make something, and what the challenges are when you're working in a site that's remote, that's unknown, and that will actually have to come down at the end. And we wanted to really think about that carefully. And so part of this was using a kind of simple metal sheet that could be folded to become structure, to become a roof, to become furniture. That's all relatively easily assembled and could easily be disassembled. That was very important to us, so that the material could be reused, could be sold, and ultimately, hopefully, this wouldn't wind up just going for waste. So these are some of the images from it. And during COVID, they were still able to teach classes to children, and they also work with the kind of local high school children, and have students come actually from all over France to participate, as well as it's become really a part of their school now that the students use it. It's not just for kids, but they were able to teach during COVID. And generally the biennials projects don't stay up very long. And as I understand it, will be up for at least 5 years. So we're really happy and excited that that was able to happen for it. So, all right, so I'll end there. Thank you so much. I'm happy to take questions. I'm not sure.
Hi, Hilary. That was a wonderful presentation, very inspiring. I put a question in the chat. I'm not sure if you can read it, but it's really about the representation of your projects, that they feel very sort of soft and accessible, that is dissimilar from so many architectural renderings. And a lot of my students, I teach in landscape architecture and teach a graphic communications course, and a lot of my students use your work as
Oh, I can't hear you. I'm sorry. Is that just me?
No, I think we lost Katya, but basically her question is also in the chat, and
Okay.
she wanted to know about how do you arrive at the distinct style of representation that you've developed.
Sure. Yeah. Well, thank you so much. That's amazing to hear about your students using our drawings and looking at them. It's really wonderful to hear that. So thank you. I think for Michael and I, we've talked a lot about how, it goes, in some ways it goes back to when we were students. We were in school pre-computer, pre-digital. We're kind of the generation on the cusp where it was just starting to literally come online as we were ending our undergraduate, and that by the time we got to graduate school, we had already had to learn how to use different kinds of softwares on our own. We learned, through trial and error, learned by working in offices and teaching ourselves. We were not trained in a majority of the programs that we use, and so that was something, that I think we still retain that kind of attitude, I guess, that, we sort of teach ourselves sometimes, which is maybe strange considering we're also teachers, but also that just as we switched from drawing by hand to drawing in the computer, what, an incredibly colorful world it is. And, that we wanted to have the drawings also reflect that. So it's very much in kind of exercise in, reflecting on, the atmosphere and the environment that we're in as architects and designers every day in doing our work. So, and, a lot of the drawings, it's also just about trying to capture different moments of either the process of building, the time we're in, just I'm trying to enjoy the things that we see around us, and also I would say, at the same time to call attention to things and that maybe are not, as architects, you wouldn't have that as part of a project necessarily, but the drawings allow us to do more sometimes.
Thank you.
So, can you hear me?
I'll repeat the question.
Okay, so it seems like she uses a lot of models. I'm curious what her workflow is, like digital, what kind of mix do you use?
So one of the students have asked that it appears that you use a lot of models in your work as well, and wanted to know about the workflow and the development of projects.
Yeah, I think it's a good question, and I think we're always doing everything at once. We it's not a linear process for us, and so that can be frustrating sometimes. But we're drawing in the computer, we're making sketches, we're printing things out, drawing on them, making models. We rarely have made models that are done at the end of the design process, where we just make a model of what we designed. Rarely. We're always making things at pretty large scale. So that's also something, and we don't usually we don't usually glue anything. We usually pin things so we can change it. So as we're working and testing and photographing our models, we used to make videos more than, we've been really busy. Videos take a long time, but we had gone through a whole period where we were making videos. I think we've turned more to making books now as part of that. So I don't know, I hope that answers your question.
Someone's asking about the performance of the solar chimneys on that project.
Yeah, I think that project, we tried to think about how we could, because we don't have access to air conditioning, and we had also done a floating house in Canada that was a kind of similar project in terms of just sort of extreme site conditions. That project in particular is only accessible from May to October, so it has no heating and no cooling. And we thought about ways of just really opening and ventilating the space. So the idea for the solar chimney is that air volume heats up, and then when you open the windows and the doors, will draw air through up and out to try to keep the space cool. It really also comes from looking at more local and regional conditions across the Southwest. We did a lot of research into thinking about different house types and performance, which comes out of some of the research that we had done for the corridor house that was part of the Chicago Biennial. So sort of each of our projects kind of builds on one another. This is something we've been interested in making a part of the practice. And it's not that we are, for each project, it's not that we necessarily start over completely, or we're not always starting from a kind of blank slate, even if the site itself has nothing on it. So we're always trying to sort of learn from previous projects and work with that.
So a question from the chat: is there a temperature limit at which the chimney house in New Mexico is uncomfortable?
I'm not sure. I think it would probably, any house that doesn't have air conditioning, which there's a lot of housing that doesn't have air conditioning, so the idea, at least with the solar chimney, is you would still have airflow that is just based on air and movement, without an electric fan or using energy.
I'm new to New Mexico, and one of the things I learned about this climate is the swamp cooler. Some homes here don't have refrigerant cooling. They have this, it's evaporative cooling that's water based. Yeah. And learning this climate, and which I would assume is similar to that home. It's very cool in the morning, and then it gets very hot in the afternoon. That the way that we've been designing these systems for buildings is like this, achieving this level of comfort 100% of the time, where these homes historically have been, and even from the indigenous examples, there were times that people just knew they were going to be uncomfortable, right? The level of comfort is how much discomfort can you endure, but it's a really clever idea for this climate. Is this another question from the chat?
Yeah.
Yeah, did the research on the chimneys offer a temperature degree change?
I think, the project is really, yeah, I worked with Atelier 10, a climate engineering firm. At the time, the engineer I worked with was in New York and also New Haven. But, so I think we studied them. The project was built a while ago now. I don't have all the details in front of me. I can certainly send you a little book that we made on it. We built pretty big models and did a lot of digital studies on that. I think one of the things too important here is just the access to water. So Chris, as you were talking about that, even the artists, they have to stock up on water, and they have built a kind of collection of rainwater systems to collect water. So, it's really, it's trying to figure out how to work with the environment, and it's constantly changing. So that's also something that even thinking about how things change and the kind of unpredictability of a site. For instance, one of the things I feel a little bit like we learned on this project when we started, the client wasn't even sure this is where they were going to work. They work with a variety of artists, landscape artists or land artists across the country. And when we started designing the project, we got so far and they said, wait, we might change the site. And so we actually changed the design of the base of the house, which is why it has this kind of shape, because we weren't sure where it was going to go. And, they were interested in the floating house. So maybe it could have been a floating project with pontoons underneath, or there was another site in a different city. So the idea of just architecture having to evolve and change is constant. And this is even the floating house project. When we designed it, the idea was that they might have to move it because there'd be too much water. It's kind of the opposite problem. But in the end, what they actually found now recently is, in fact, there's not enough water. And so they may have to move it because there's potentially not enough water to keep it where it is. So there's just things that you can't anticipate in some ways, but we have learned so much in the last few years about this, and I think we'll continue to learn that. But I think for us, that's also part of why we're interested in these different, different ways that pieces can break down into smaller parts.
So another question from Katya in the chat. She says, maybe unpopular, maybe very popular. You said you just worked very, very hard. How do you recharge? Does it ever feel too overwhelming?
Sure. I mean, there's all different things. Architecture is a very demanding and challenging profession. And I think, we also have two small children. I have 10-year-old twins. So they help keep us distracted and in good ways. And but we do a lot of drawing, a lot of family. Maybe we can edit this part out but, for the recording. But we also do ceramics together as a family, and it's really wonderful. So
I wouldn't edit it out because the reason why I ask is that, one of the questions that I have had as a student and an educator and just a person is sometimes the life we're living feels unsustainable when we are really concerned with ideas of sustainability. And, I'm always hoping for a change, that we don't work ourselves to the bone as much as we love it, that we do have time for other things. And so I wouldn't edit it out because I think a lot of people have the same questions, and we have students that have families. We have junior faculty that have families, and it's just, there's so much. It's like,
yeah, for sure. I mean, I think, it is very challenging, and especially the last couple of years, I think, in being a woman architect, and, I think this is, the kind of wonderful thing that you've invited me in the kind of honor of your previous faculty member and architect, that, Michael does a lot. Also, we have a kind of great, I think, we work together, but we also have these wonderful children together, and, we've had to balance a lot, and there is no balance. You just kind of figure it out as it goes. But, I think also something people don't often talk a lot about too is, in the case of us, we have aging parents. And so we're sort of a sandwich generation. We're kind of between.
Right.
And, and so we're just trying to, make family a priority as well. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Another question in the chat from TK. TK says, thanks, Hilary. Can you speak more about your interest in social commentary through your work? Do you see new avenues architects engage / influence more in culture?
Oh, yeah, it's a great question. I think this is a really hard question. I mean, I would, I think we're trying. We go back and forth on things. I mean, we are architects. There is only so much architects can do. As much as we want to say we can do everything, I'm not sure that's always so productive. But I think in the way that, through our drawings, as one example, we can try to do things where we might not actually have the space or the resources to do it in reality or in part of a built project. We can try, although maybe in some ways that seems a little bit weak, because you'd much rather build it and make things happen. And I can think specifically with respect to things like housing and affordable housing, to be able to have opportunities to do more work. But that's a very complex program. There's so many issues and policies and laws and codes that have to be navigated and understood. And at the end of the day, speaking about affordable housing, you're really beholden to whether or not an underwriter is going to fund a particular project. And so if you're trying to do something really different, it's too different, it becomes difficult to afford. And particularly, I would say that's in this country, and things also like, what does the market bear? This is what we're up against. And so, we're trying, but it's really challenging. So.
Well, thank you, Hilary. I am very pleased that you're able to join us in this position. Also very happy that you are also engaging our students in different courses. So we look forward to continuing our relationship with you, and thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you so much.